What are the most romantic movies of all time, you may ask? Well, look no further, because today I'm going to be going through the most romantic movies of all time. The sweetest, most tear-jerkiest movies ever. I think I just made up that word, which is great. But if that's what you're looking for, I'm going to be going through some of the greatest and my favorite of these movies ever. So without further ado, let's get right into this list of the most romantic movies ever. And before we continue any further, please subscribe to this channel, hit that bell notification so that you get notified whenever we upload any more great content. Feel free to comment below what other topics you'd like me to cover, and like the video as well. That would really help us out, and we thank you so much for all your support. Can't wait to get more into this topic. Hello, and welcome back to the Adam Kiss Show. So to start it off, the most romantic movie of all time, I would have to say, would be Brief Encounter, directed by David Lean. And this is a very unusual choice. Most people would say a movie like The Notebook, which actually, I've seen it, I appreciate it for what it is, but I'm maybe not as much of a fan of a movie like that. Though it definitely is a romantic movie, it makes it on a lot of lists of most romantic movies ever. But for me, I would have to say Brief Encounter. And now the reason why it's controversial is because not much happens. There's not that much romance. There's not really much kissing or sex or anything like that in the movie, which is what makes it more interesting. It's all about but despite that, it manages to be really an incredibly romantic movie. It's about two people who are both married to other people who meet and have a brief encounter, essentially. They fall in love at the train station over the course of a few weeks. And it's really an emotional movie. It's really about love and loss, and it really brings a tear to your eye whenever you watch it. It's just incredibly emotional. It's really one of the greatest movies ever made, and it's certainly, I would say, underrated. Nobody talks about that movie when you talk about David Lean. They usually talk about Lawrence of Arabia, Dr. Zhivago, The Bridge on the River Kwai, or even his later works, which are not as critically acclaimed, like A Passage to India or Ryan's Daughter. Ryan's Daughter is another very romantic movie. It's basically a remake of Madame Bovary. I believe his screenwriter Robert Bolt wanted to do a remake of Madame Bovary, and they decided to set it in a different location and kind of change things around a little bit. But essentially, the story is like Madame Bovary. But getting back to the topic at hand, Brief Encounter, it's a movie I absolutely love. It's in black and white, which is interesting. It's with Trevor Howard and Celia Johnson, I believe is her name. Correct me if I'm wrong, but offhand, that's what I believe the names are. Trevor Howard is obviously a legend of British cinema. He was also in another classic British movie, The Third Man. And I mean, The Third Man and Brief Encounter, together, they would easily make the top 10 list of greatest British movies ever made. It's also interesting that one of the most romantic movies is British because, you know, there's the typical British reserve. The characters in the movie are definitely very reserved. They don't express their feelings like crazy, which kind of adds to the whole atmosphere of the movie, I believe. Again, it's an incredible movie. Absolutely recommend it to everyone. So next on my list, I would have to say another David Lean movie, Dr. Zhivago. Again, this movie was in the 60s. It was a bigger scale by David Lean. It's set during the Russian Revolution, but it's not really about the Russian Revolution. It's about the people that it affects, the people that big events in history affects. You don't see all the big heroes or villains of the Russian Revolution. You just see the regular people of varying degrees. And I think that's a beautiful thing. It has a beautiful love story as well. The soundtrack can't hurt. It has an absolutely romantic and incredible soundtrack by Maurice Jarre, I believe his name was. He ended up collaborating with Lean on so many different occasions. But really, one of his best scores was for Dr. Zhivago. The only thing that I would say would probably top it would be his Lawrence of Arabia score. But obviously in Lawrence of Arabia, there's not much of a love story. It's really not about that. But as for Dr. Zhivago, yes, absolutely incredible. It's a very romantic movie. That's how I would describe it. Even when there's not a romance on screen or something like that, it's just overall done with a romantic flair. So, number three, I would say an obvious choice, Love Story, starring Ryan O'Neal and Ali MacGraw. It's an incredible movie. I absolutely love it. And that's really, there's not much I can say that hasn't been said. It's definitely a very popular movie, a very famous movie. It's sometimes parodied, but really it was one of the original great love stories. So, gotta love it. All right, so next I'll have to say Amélie. This is a French movie. And again, this is all of my choices so far have been a little bit controversial. I haven't gone with all the obvious choices. And by the way, I'm talking through this list in no particular order. But again, it's not an obvious choice because most of the story, Amélie is alone. Only at the very end is there actually any kind of true... The whole movie has a romantic vibe. But only at the end is there actually some maybe romantic scenes with the main character. But it's just an incredible movie. It has an aura of romance. It has an aura of magic. It's just one of those movies you can't really put your finger on. A great movie. Not as many people know it as should, I think. I mean, there's that famous scene in the cinema that everybody knows that image. But other than that, I find that it's surprising not many more people know about it. So that's another great one. So again, in no particular order, the next movie that I was thinking of when I thought of romantic movies is Casablanca, directed by Michael Curtiz, starring Humphrey Bogart and Ingrid Bergman. One of the most romantic movies, if not the most romantic movie of all time. Absolutely heartbreaking, gut-wrenching movie. That ending, satisfying, but obviously heartbreaking. And that's really, in a lot of great romantic movies, there aren't necessarily happy endings. That's just the nature of it. I mean, how many romantic plays, even Shakespeare, the tragedies like Romeo and Juliet, does not have a happy ending, obviously. A lot of great romances don't have happy endings. I mean, I know there's the famous quote by Orson Welles that if you want a happy ending, just end the story earlier. And I know that's true in so many cases, like in those Shakespearean comedies, where everyone gets married at the end. I mean, they end at the wedding, but what if they ended a few years later when they were all getting divorced? So again, romance is an interesting subject with that. I mean, you can have happy endings. Sometimes they do have happy endings. We hope that, in life they have happy endings. That's definitely, I think, all of our hopes. But it doesn't always work out like that. Alas, unfortunately. So the next one that I wanted to recommend was Notting Hill, written by Richard Curtis, one of my favorite screenwriters, definitely. Certainly one of my favorite current British screenwriters. He's written a lot of classics, Four Weddings and a Funeral, Notting Hill, obviously, Love Actually, a couple of others. But I love his work. I love his style. That one is with Julia Roberts and Hugh Grant. It's really an interesting movie. It's not a typical rom-com. It definitely has something special to it. There's been a lot of great rom-coms. That's a whole genre that says romantic comedy. I know that really a lot of those early movies with Cary Grant started the whole genre. A lot of great movies. It kind of started, I would say, in my opinion, with the movie It Happened One Night with Clark Gable and Claudette Colbert. That was definitely, in my opinion, one of the first real great romantic comedies. And then really it just sped up from there. Then Cary Grant took it over, Gregory Peck, Jimmy Stewart did some. So it's kind of, the genre really took off. And there's definitely some great ones. I mentioned Gregory Peck as well. Roman Holiday is a great romantic movie. Certainly one of the greatest romantic movies ever made. Starring Gregory Peck, and I believe it was the screen debut of Audrey Hepburn. It was directed by William Wyler on location in Rome, which was very unusual, certainly for that time, for the 1950s. I believe it was done in 1953. Another name that I just mentioned in passing was Cary Grant, definitely considered the king of the romantic comedy during his era. I think that Gregory Peck once remarked that he had the feeling that all of his scripts went to Cary Grant first. And that was true. I mean, Cary Grant was offered Roman Holiday, the movie I just talked about. But he also did so many great romantic comedies and romantic movies of his own. And I think one in particular, if we're talking about romantic movies, is An Affair to Remember. I know that this movie is referenced in the Tom Hanks movie, Sleepless in Seattle, which is another romantic movie. But An Affair to Remember was actually a remake. There was a previous version of the same story, directed also by the same director, Leo McCarey, but that was starring Charles Boyer instead of Cary Grant, and that was in 1939, I believe, and Affair to Remember is in 1957, at least as far as my recollection goes, but you can correct me on that if I'm wrong. But anyway, it's an absolutely touching story, very romantic movie, and it's famous for a reason, I would say. So after that, there's Love is a Many Splendored Thing with William Holden. Very romantic movie. Very much ahead of its time, I would say, in its subject matter and everything. Again, it's one of those sad movies, so I have to warn you. Does not have a happy ending, as so many don't. But sometimes these movies have a sad ending, and sometimes they have a sad ending with a tinge of hope. But this is really a very sad ending, very tragic. And it's just an incredible movie. I was always touched by it. It has one of the greatest scores of any movie. It was made into a song called Love is a Many Splendored Thing, which I believe was also a hit on its own, certainly in its own right. So again, I absolutely love that movie. Okay, so another one that I have written down here is The Way We Were, starring Barbra Streisand and Robert Redford. A funny story is that originally Robert Redford didn't want to be a part of the production. It was directed by Pollock, who he knew very well. Redford did. They ended up working together so many times, but they really had to convince him to be a part of this project. He was, I believe, concerned about Barbra Streisand starring with her, as well as some other things. But eventually, I believe they expanded his part. They made it more complex, and he ended up doing it. And it really ended up being a great movie, a very classic romantic movie. All right, so another one I wrote down here is The Umbrellas of Cherbourg. It's a French movie, and it's actually basically a musical. I don't believe there's a single word that's not sung. It's a really very interesting concept, but very emotional movie. It's the kind of movie that after you see it, you'll feel different for a few days. It really stays with you. I love movies like that, but very romantic, very sad, very tragic, very heavy movie, but definitely worth the watch. Great. So that was very briefly some of the greatest, most romantic movies of all time. Thanks so much for watching, and be sure to follow me on all social media accounts, Instagram, YouTube, TikTok, Twitter, etc. And thank you so much. Have a great day.
Well, I'm standing in for you, okay? Am I tall enough?
That's my chair, by the way.
Yes, and nobody else can use it. Ha ha! Good.
It's true. I have to have very big tripods.
Yes, very big.
Extra large
Huge.
tripods.
Yeah, special order.
Special order, custom made.
Custom made, yeah. That's right.
All right. See you all later.
See you later. Let me just turn it off.